Hello, my name is Laurie Davidson, and I am the project manager for NNELS, that's the National Network for Equitable Library Service. And today we have a panel to talk about accessibility and audiobooks. I'll introduce the panel members in a moment, but what we want to cover, sort of the broad issues that we hope that this panel will delve into with their expertise and knowledge, is looking at some of the accessibility issues in mainstream audiobook formats. We want to talk a little bit about the DAISY standard for audiobooks and how it is used. We're going to delve into the new audiobook standard. Want to talk about the various ways that different organizations and publishers produce audiobooks, and also look at some automated tools that are used to make audiobooks more accessible. So with that in mind, as our broad sort of topics, I am going to go through and introduce each member of our panel. And I'll begin with Jessica Elbert. Jessica, do you want to say hi?
Hi, Laurie.
Hey, Jessica. So Jessica is the Digital and Art Director at ECW Press, where she works on ebooks, accessibility, audiobooks, book covers, and metadata. She has been working to overhaul the digital production and metadata systems at ECW to apply accessibility standards to their ebooks and hands-on fluid control to their communication through metadata. Thanks, Jessica. Next on the panel is Danny Faris. Danny, do you want to say hi?
Hello.
Hello, Danny. Danny is a blind software engineer from British Columbia. He's also an accessibility tester with NNELS, the National Network for Equitable Library Service. An avid reader. He's listened to audiobooks from everything from digital DAISY, audio CD, and even cassette tape. Next, we've got Robert Gordon.
Hi.
Hey, Robert. So Robert Gordon manages the CNIB's audio publishing and distribution departments, coordinating the creation and circulation of DAISY audio productions in French and English on behalf of CELA, the Center for Equitable Library Access. Next up is Simon Jager. Simon, do you want to say hi? Hey, Simon. Simon is an accessibility tester at NNELS, as well as a technology and accessibility enthusiast, audio producer, and avid reader. He has experience with a wide variety of reading software and devices and excellent working knowledge of audio formats, as well as 10 years of audio editing and production experience. Welcome, Simon. And lastly, we have Wendy Reed.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Wendy. And Wendy is a senior QA at Rakuten Kobo, where she works with Kobo's mobile apps and device teams to improve reading experiences, promote accessibility, and raise quality. She is also one of the chairs of the publishing working group at the W3C and editor of the audiobooks specification. So welcome, Wendy. So let's begin. So our first question, and the first question, we're going to get a little bit of the user perspective. So from, we're going to call on Danny and Simon to speak a little bit to this question. So the question is are commercial and mainstream audiobooks accessible? And why might they not be accessible or usable for everyone? And I'm also going to ask you to speak a little bit to what alternative formats exist and do you use instead of mainstream formats? Danny, do you want to start?
Sure. So commercial audiobooks today are typically packaged in what I call a loose format. So tracks are set up as separate audio files and often distributed in an archive. Because there isn't a standard to how those tracks are supposed to be named or presented, producers tend to produce their books in different ways depending on what works best for their workflow. That results in an inconsistent user experience, and you never know exactly what you're going to get when you unpack an audiobook. Tracks may play out of order. It may be difficult or impossible to listen to the book from start to finish, depending on how those tracks are ordered and what playback system you're using. And it can be difficult to move from one track to the next, especially if you're looking for a particular track, because the file names are most often used to indicate the chapter name or number that you're moving to.
Thanks, Danny. And Simon?
That was really well said. I remember a time I had to play a book out of order on my CD player. It wasn't a fun day. So basically what Danny said about there being no consistency to the user experience, that's a huge problem. And some of the other problems that I think we face a lot are lack of ability to reference certain information and know what we're jumping between when we're going from section to section. There are certain things like footnotes that we really should be able to jump to as easily as a sighted user could just glance down the page. We can't do that either. And I'm hoping that this can be solved.
And Simon, can you speak a little bit to some of the other formats, like the DAISY format and how that works, or does it work better, or what your experience is with that?
I think as long as you have a compatible device, DAISY is a fairly viable option. It's just a matter of having something that supports it, and there needs to be consistency between formats and the user experience that you get with those formats.
And Simon, as a user who is blind, can you just briefly explain the process and the technology that you use when you are ready to listen to an audiobook?
Most often now, because the discoverability is there, I tend to go for something on Audible, which has issues of its own, plenty. The book standard is not really there. There's a DRM on the book, so if I don't want to or can't listen in the Audible app, that's a problem, which of course would be a huge barrier to anyone who is less technically inclined or doesn't have a computer or a smartphone. But that's sort of become my process now.
Simon, I like that you touched on discoverability, and that's another thing that is currently quite lacking in today's commercial audiobooks. The standard doesn't allow for consistent metadata to be offered for titles themselves. So it can be difficult to discover them, which can have an impact on distribution. It also makes it difficult for a standardized format for the reading system to indicate the title, the author, the copyright date. So that is another thing that I feel is really lacking in the current method of distributing commercial audiobooks.
Yeah, I don't even know if Audible keeps the metadata in the book or if it just keeps it in your library separately.
DAISY is such a great alternative because it allows for discoverability. It allows for skippable and escapable structures. It provides a continuous play order that is virtually guaranteed to work on compatible devices. But its difficulty resides, in my opinion, in the fact that it is an alternate format. So publishers on a whole aren't producing books in DAISY format because it's designed for a subset of the market. So in order for people to listen to a DAISY book, that commercial audiobook needs to be converted with some level of human intervention into a DAISY book. That means DAISY books are inherently more expensive and the selection is much smaller.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Simon. Any last thoughts before we go on to the next question? Great, thanks. Okay, so the next question, we're going to get the perspective of Jessica from a publisher and Robert from CNIB, who's for making an alternate format of audiobooks. And that is, can you just each walk us through the process or your process on how each of your organizations make audiobooks? Jessica, let's start with you.
Sure. So ECW is a trade publisher, which means we create books for the retail market. That's our main business. So our audiobooks too are made for the retail market. They're going to be sold on places like Audible, on places like Kobo. And those vendors mostly don't have requirements for any kind of accessibility requirements. But because accessibility is part of our mandate at ECW, we've launched a project to create more what I might refer to as accessible audiobooks. But what we're really doing is creating an audiobook. We're recording an audiobook that's more friendly to having the DAISY overlay applied to it, which is not something that we would do at the publishing house. But we're recording it in a way that is mindful of the features that Daisy Talking Books have. So that means going and creating a plan for things like bibliographies, footnotes, some of the things that Danny and Simon mentioned, as well as creating descriptions for images that appear in the print book. So we will create this at a standard audiobook that you might encounter on Audible, but now we're creating sort of an audiobook plus with chapters that you may want to skip if you're not interested in listening to someone read out about bibliography. But those features are there so that they can connect into the kind of work that Robert is doing.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Robert?
Okay, I guess what I should do, maybe just describe the production method itself. So CNIB, having been at it for a long time, you know, we've built up a staff of experienced people, but also we have between the Montreal studio and Toronto, we've got about 230, 250 volunteers. And that's really what helps us to be able to produce on a very large scale. So the volunteers that have been with us, the average length of time is about 17 years. And we've got people that were with us recording on reel-to-reel tape and have been with us for a very long time. But basically what I'll do is to describe also how, with recording volunteers, how different it is than with, say, paid narrators. When you're working with a paid narrator, the project is the focus of the producer and also the performer. And you work as long as you can to get it done and get it over to post-production. With the volunteer-based model, we are leveraging skills for both sets. So we'll have on one side of the glass, the narrator. On the other side of the glass is a technician. About halfway through their shift, they're going to switch positions. There are a few people who will be a technician and a narrator of their own book, but we are quite selective with that because we need to make sure that not only are they able to do the technician role, but also the proofing role, which is a real benefit that we have from having a volunteer on the other side of the glass working as technician, because they can say, you misread that, or can we do that again, or it sounded a little fuzzy. Now, so that's basically the structure of what we do. Most volunteers are coming in once a week. We've got a few that'll come in as many as 3 times a week. But with the volunteer coming in once a week, we are going to have a longer production time. And most of the books that we produce, we aim for 6 months. So from the time that it is requested to the time that it is delivered, about 6 months. That becomes tougher when you've got a longer book, which has a shorter period of time. But that's, you know, we've been juggling these things for a very long time. It's okay. All of our books are currently recorded in LP Studio, in large part because LP Studio its interface is very simple for a person who is coming to us as a volunteer. Most volunteers, in my experience, they're not, it isn't their technical skills that drew them to us. It's the desire to have an impact on increasing the number of accessible books. Almost every one of these people has a person in their family or somebody that they care about who is affected by vision loss or print disabilities. Now, the main thing is they're talkers. We get people who are lawyers or teachers or performers. That's really the thing that unifies them. It isn't the technical skills. So we wanted to have a interface which is relatively simple. It's actually, if you, doesn't perfect way to say it, but it is a verbal interface. And when our producers are creating a structure, the structure is an exact mirror of the print book. Both people, narrator and technician, are having the book in front of them and they're reading along. When we build a Daisy book, we're building it from the page up. We will include everything, including things like the back flap. In my mind, one of the key components, it's really everybody's mind, I'm sure, at this particular panel, is that the book should include everything that's in the printed original. And that's one of our starting points. And of course, the images should be described, and it needs to be structured in a way that mirrors the print original so that the person who is using the book can navigate it in exactly the same way. Now, you know, with a lot of what we're doing is we're able to do it because we have volunteer resources, because we have a long period of time. But lately we're with the work from home. We don't have volunteers in the studio right now.
Mm-hmm.
The studio staff are working from home. There's an opportunity that's presented itself there for us to look at other technologies. So we're gently exploring Hindenburg, mainly looking at its benefits for post-production.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got people recording in half the book in the studio over here and then the other half of the book in their house, there are things within Hindenburg which will actually allow you to modulate and to make it so that it all seems unified. So that's basically an overview of what we do. All of our French work is being done out of Montreal. All the English work is being done out of Toronto. And baseline, we do about 600 books a year, and the vast majority of it is for CLF. And we will work on whatever book they request. So we have zero input. We work with publishers a lot now too. We have no interest in choosing the type of books. We leave that to the people that are requesting the books and commissioning them. Our goal is to make the audiobook a mirror of what is in the printed book. So that's probably more procedural and element than tech, but that's basically how we do what we do.
Great. Thanks, Robert. I think we'll go on, and well, actually, I did have a kind of question out of that, which may be a part of the next question, but that is, so that's creating an audiobook where you're doing the narration. What's the process when you get an audiobook and then you turn it into a DAISY format or a more accessible audiobook?
So, okay, when we're dealing with public libraries, they have their audience, patrons, are interested in listening to the same audiobooks that are available to other people. So we purchase or acquire a lot of HarperCollins audiobooks or Blackstone audiobooks. And when they come to us, it is just a series of files. It's a series of audio files, as was mentioned before. A lot of times they have odd naming configurations, but what we have is we have programmers who are working with us, and they're able to take either the books that we create or audiobooks that we acquire. There's a thing called BuildBot, which is created by our group. Okay, so our IT people put together that. Simply described, BuildBot is a group of Python code. It approaches each book in like a bespoke way as an individual book. So if they got a book coming through to BuildBot, which is MP3s coming from HarperCollins, it can deal with that. If we sent on a full DAISY book, it can deal with that. And then what it does is it takes the Python code, takes the book, and then it augments it with metadata to enhance its discoverability. It will spin off a DAISY 2.02, or conceivably any format, but that master is then spun off into other formats. So I believe they still have some of them, but up until recently, we would allow people to do a download of a zip MP3. Even though we created it as a DAISY book, that option is available to them. So by having the Python code create a new master, we then have the next part of BuildBot is to spin that distribution master into the output formats desired by the client. So we have this custom solution to deal with a lot of that.
Right. Great. Thanks, Robert. So that leads well into the next question, which I'll get Jessica and Wendy to speak to. So what automated tools do you use to make audiobooks more accessible? And this is within, for Jessica and Wendy, within your mainstream accessible audiobook creation. Wendy.
I might have to pass this over to Jessica. So at Kobo, we do have originals. They are produced in-house. I am not on that team though. So Jessica probably has more information about the production of accessible audiobooks than I do, but I can talk a little bit about what they hope they look like in the future. because there's a big difference between what's being produced today and what I hope will be produced very soon. But
do you want to talk about that now, or do you want to do that in the next question where you're talking about the new audiobook spec? Yeah?
Yeah, I'll let Jessica go and explain how ECW is doing it.
Great. Jessica.
Well, maybe this won't be a very exciting answer then, because on our end, we don't have a ton of automation. In the particular workflow about creating a more accessible audiobook, of course, we have our audio producers have their own QA that there is some automation there, but that's just a standard audiobook thing. But as far as the work we're doing to create more accessible audiobooks, it's actually a lot of hands-on work as opposed to something that you can automate. And I think this is actually an interesting question because of that answer, because I think it's important for publishers and creators to know that creating an accessible audiobook, a more accessible audiobook, is something that's hands-on. It's for people who know the content or who are willing to learn what the content is. It's a more editorial process. It's about reviewing the book, encountering different types of content, asides and footnotes and images, and deciding how to deal with those in a way that can create, in our case, a commercial audiobook and an audiobook that will go to places like CELA, and that could have a DAISY overlay applied so that we're doing that work for them in advance. So yeah, it is really actually, it increases the amount of time that it takes us to put an audiobook into production, because there's a whole stage at the front end about learning the content and deciding how to adapt it. And that's something that you can't automate, and is actually better. It works better when the person doing it has a familiarity with the book and has sort of a stake in the book. And also it works better when that person understands the end result of how that will be experienced as well.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I can add a little bit on that, just because coming from the side of having the experience of working on the reading system side, so implementing players for audiobooks so that users can enjoy them. There is, I think there's a lot of energy around wanting to automate as much of these kind of processes as possible, but Jessica's completely right. There's a lot to do with user experience, and especially with audio, that is very difficult to automate, just because I think when you compare it to ebooks, for instance, there's not a lot of code to mess around with or to check, like with an automated accessibility checker, for instance, for EPUB. You're just checking to make sure that all the H1s are H1s or the P tags are P tags. But in an audiobook, you don't have that. There isn't those kind of markers that you're looking for. And so a lot of the testing is really listening for the things that you're expecting to hear, making sure that when you hit chapter 1, it goes to chapter 1. When you hit chapter 2, it goes to chapter 2. And that is pretty manual. And so I think a lot of publishers should know that when they're setting out on this journey to make better audiobooks, or even just to start making audiobooks, expect to spend a little bit of time with your content just to make sure that it is produced in a way that works for all of your listeners.
Mm-hmm. Good. And Danny, I wonder if you can comment a little bit on some of the tools that NNELS uses for audiobook creation.
So I'm listening with interest to BuildBot, Robert, because in some ways it sounds similar to the tool we've designed here at NNELS, which is called the NNELS Automated Converter. This is a web application that takes a series of MP3 files that comprise an audiobook and adds DAISY 2.02 navigation code to it. It also has the ability to add metadata and has some features for renaming chapters, adding some part level navigation, and a few other things like that. And one of the things we're excited about with this tool is in the future, down the line, to interface this with the NNELS repository so we can automatically pull that metadata from the repository of books and start to plug in accessible editions. So we're both on the same page, which is really cool.
Great, thanks, Danny. Okay, let's go to the next question. And Wendy, I'm going to ask you to take a few moments and just, can you do an overview of the new audiobook spec? You've been quite involved in it. So yeah, if you can give us a sort of a thumbnail sketch of what it is.
Of course. So the new audiobook specification is being produced by the Publishing Working Group at the W3C. We're a group of publishers, reading systems, publishing adjacent businesses that are all interested in the future of what digital publishing looks like on the web. And so the audiobooks specification actually came out of a separate project we were doing on web publications. And we were trying to figure out how could we take this kind of, it was getting kind of monstrous because every niche publication wanted a part of it. And we were like, oh, well, how do we focus? We really want to focus on something to really like figure out if the assumptions that we were making were correct. And it actually came up to be audiobooks because at the time I and a few others were working on audiobooks as part of our businesses. And one thing a lot of us noticed right away is that there wasn't a consistent way for audiobooks to be delivered. Simon and Danny actually mentioned some of the things that we were seeing on the reading system side, where you're getting, a folder full of MP3 files that may or may not be named properly. We were having all sorts of data problems, making sure that the books were the right length, were they in the right order, was it the right book? Like there were a lot of issues that we encountered, and one of the things that I thought is, why isn't there a standard for this? It doesn't make sense. Ebooks have been distributed under EPUB and a similar standard for almost 20 years now. Why isn't there an audiobook standard? Audiobooks have been around since the 20s, earlier, Edison. And so we set out to say, like, can we produce a common standard that solves some of these data problems? So making sure that the chapters have the right titles, making sure we know how long the chapters are, providing that metadata to tell us what is this audiobook, what is the author, publication date, all of this basic information that I think everyone's expressed an interest in seeing. And the other thing that we wanted to do, because we operate within the W3C, is we wanted to make it accessible. That's it's a pillar of W3C specs. They have to provide accessible options. And what we saw is, on top of all these data problems, it wasn't a good experience for all users. You kind of had to shoehorn features in as opposed to having them provided to you by the content. So the spec today actually is super flexible. We use a JSON data format. It basically is just a single file manifest. You can list all the contents of an audiobook. You can list any supplemental content. So that could be stuff like the cover image, a table of contents, a PDF that contains pictures from the author's life, stuff like that, all the various things that tend to come with both books and audiobooks. And then on top of that, we provided a method to map audio content to text content so that a user can actually listen to the book and read it at the same time if a reading system allows. This is all contingent on reading systems, but it is really a way to just kind of solve all these problems in a single format, as opposed to having multiple formats that solve different problems for different people. And what we're really hoping for is that if publishers start using this format, maybe they don't make it accessible by default. We hope they do, but maybe they can't. It means that they can send that format to organizations like CELA or NNELS, and it's so much easier for you guys to actually overlay that other content on top to send it to users way faster.
Great, thanks, Wendy. So with that overview, I'm going to go to Simon next. So Simon, with the new audiobook standard, and in terms of what accessibility and usability issues, in terms of what it solves, in your view, when you think about it, how will it make the mainstream user experience better?
Well, I'm actually really excited about this. So, I mean, first of all, it solves pretty much all of the issues we've brought up. The file name consistency alone is a huge problem, and knowing that a format will specify the reading order and just allow a user to step through it in the way they wish is fantastic. Also, having a separation between the main content of the book and supplemental content would allow reading devices and reading systems to let the user skip over that supplemental content if they want, but go back to it. And I think I thought about bringing this up in the beginning, but I wasn't sure how relevant it was, but I guess I should have. The ability to synchronize text and audio in a mainstream format is huge. I don't think we have that at all. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But the ability to go through something and be able to look at the text content, because sometimes it's easier or more practical for some reason for any number of reasons, especially reading print disability related, for somebody to read a book in audio, but that doesn't mean they don't need the ability to go through and look at the spellings of words or other specifics like that. I mean, some people read their textbooks in audio, and so we have to think about how this format will impact that, not just leisure reading and things.
Good, thanks, Simon. And Danny, do you have anything to add to that?
The sync media specification that Wendy and Simon have touched on now is tremendously exciting. One of the largest reasons for opponents of the new audiobook standard is the phrase navigation that's offered through DAISY. And it's one of the features that DAISY readers really appreciate because it allows you to skip logically through that track. You're not just skipping by 5 seconds or 10 seconds and arriving halfway through a sentence. You're logically skipping by phrase or sentence or even paragraph is an incredibly useful navigation. And this specification allows for any level of granularity to move sequentially and logically through those tracks so you can find your place. So you can look for a particular piece of information that you know is hidden within a chapter. So having that ability in this new standard, along with all the other benefits that we've talked about, is so exciting because it really allows for any of these features to be encompassed within the standard. And it's up to producers, publishers, whoever is working with that book to add whatever features they want to. It's all possible now.
Great, thanks, Danny. And then I guess the next question, and Robert, I'll have you speak to this, is in terms of the new standard, what are the issues with it, or what things does it not solve that the DAISY format does offer?
Okay, and I would actually like to circle back just to offer a couple of words of praise. In particular, the whole approach to creating this standard is taking the driving of the standard from the distributor, right? Because like in a case like Audible, publishers know the Audible people, they write the tune that everybody dances to, but they have, you know, they are looking at a giant situation. And then the other part is just going back to the idea of that ultimately there may be another standard which becomes a marriage of EPUB and audio. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the direction that I'm hoping that we arrive at soon. And just as an aside, one of the publishers I was talking with recently is a publisher of adult literacy books. Now, this isn't something that we necessarily think of in terms of vision loss or print disability, but the ability to read and listen at the same time is perfect for spelling, for learning syntax, punctuation, grammar, even ESL. So there are, you know, if you're looking at our goal is to make accessibility a mainstream thing, all of these are just bringing more people into the Big Ten. So all of that is really good. If I was to say what it doesn't solve, it's not a technical issue. It's really about getting the distributors, the users, getting players in their hands. It's not my rap, it's Roger's, my boss, Director of Accessible Publishing, but he has a very succinct rap which basically says there's 3 pillars of accessibility. One is the content, which is what we're talking about right now. The other one is discoverability, and that goes back to almost from the first things that are said. And then the last one is for it to actually, in the format that it's in, to be able to be played on the user's player. So you get even 2 of those 3, you still aren't close to being out of the woods. So if I was going to demur, it's just that I hope that this standard is positioned in a way that it makes the mainstream, and especially the guys that are with the huge market share, that have the benefits of technology. Can you imagine the IS department at Audible, right? They probably come up with things on a daily basis. So to bring those people into our world is really what I would hope. And it might be a combination of tactics, some of which are technical, some of which are political, and some of which are economic, although it's hard. It's like dancing with, you know, a cat with an elephant. So.
Thanks, Robert. So then let's go to the next question. And Wendy, let's start with you. So if this audiobook standard does become the new standard, how will that change what you do, and what do you see as the barriers to adopting the new standard?
I desperately hope it gets adopted. That's what I'm doing right now, is trying to convince more and more companies to adopt it as their distribution and playing format. Because as I've learned, that is kind of, as Robert said, like, that is the barrier, is getting the distributors and the Audibles of the world to want to use this format. So that is what we've been working on right now. I really hope it happens, and I definitely see, if this gets adopted, it becomes, the reason we made it the way we did is we wanted to lower the barrier as much as possible for the large distributors and the large companies to get one step closer to being more accessible and providing more accessible content. Because now, one thing we were really focused on is, as someone, I forget who mentioned it, but it's not an alternate format, it's the format.
Right.
And so there's no excuse. You can't say, oh, well, it's too difficult for us to support two different formats. It's like, well, no, there's only one. You only have to support one. And so that is, I think the biggest issue really is just convincing those companies that this is a good move for them. It doesn't, accepting a new content format is not a small technical ask. You have to, speaking for Kobo, we have to accept it into our ingestion streams. We have to make sure that our servers can support it. We have client apps. We have to make sure that the client apps can take in the content and display it properly and present all the features that we want to present. And that's not a small ask. But I think by making it incremental, and the more companies that do it, the more companies that are going to feel the pressure to do it themselves. So the more publishers that ask for this format, the more distributors that offer it as an option, the more retailers that say that they want it or are willing to take it, the easier and easier it gets. And then once it's more mainstream and people start saying, oh, I want to start adding text. Oh, well, that's a feature. We can do that. Mm-hmm. It just gets, it's kind of like a, is it the rising tide? Yeah. So that's what we're hoping for, is that the more people that adopt it, the more the bar just gets lower and lower and lower to clear, to become accessible publishers and accessible applications.
Great. And just a quick question, Wendy, can you speak about the timeline of when it may become I guess, is the terminology that it becomes the official recommendation? Do you know when what that timeline might look like?
Yeah, so right now, we were actually hoping it was going to be July 1st. We're not immune to the various effects that the world has been going through with COVID-19. So we've actually extended the deadline. We are actually hoping that it'll now be October 31st, which means that we've actually extended the, we're in a phase right now called candidate recommendation, which just means that we're looking for implementers. So this actually, implementers for us is a pretty broad definition. It can be publishers, it can be distributors, and it can be content, like companies like Kobo or reading systems that can process the manifests or create the manifest files. They do some tests, they submit those tests to us, and as soon as we have a handful of passing implementations, that's when we can go and say, look, we're real, we have implementations that work, our community needs us, let's become a recommendation. So we've extended that period now through the summer. So if anyone's interested, please implement and let me know. So that period will go to the September, and then we'll go to a vote if we've met all of our criteria, and hopefully that means we'll be official by October. So
great, thanks, Wendy. And then we'll end, Jessica, for you as a publisher that creates audiobooks. Can you talk about what would be involved in implementing the new standard from your perspective?
Sure. For ECW, I think we would have a little bit faster, easier adoption than other trade publishers, especially small publishers. ECW is an independent publishing house, so I can specifically speak to smaller companies. The big guys are kind of going to do what they want to do. But for us, we would definitely be able to, we have the technological bandwidth and we have the mandate towards accessibility and for audiobooks. So it would be something that we would look at very early on. But I think that there are some barriers for companies like ECW who are in the same sort of bracket, just technical barriers, like who is making that audiobook, who's creating the manifest, and even something as simple as creating a JSON manifest for some small publishers is something that's very difficult. So there's that. And then just in publishing, if you're a trade publisher, there always has to be a business case. So those implementations that Wendy is talking about, they need to exist. There needs to be a place for us to send the books in order to start making them. And there needs to be honest, for most trade publishers, some pressure to deliver this format over the random folder of weirdly named audio files that we've clearly all been victimized in this panel by in our jobs at some point or another. So we do have to have, there does have to have some pressure from our vendors or from a market that we're not currently accessing if we don't create that format. And I think these are barriers that are totally, like we can completely overcome these barriers. We're very good in small publishing houses at banding together to figure out how to get things done. ECW is helping other publishers to create those accessible audiobooks that I was talking about earlier. We could help create to the new specification as well. And there are organizations like eBound in Canada and digital distributors, no matter where you are, who will be able to offer services. So those are things that can be overcome, but they need to be thought of first, and it's going to take a little bit of time and pressure from different areas in order for that to happen. Great,
thanks, Jessica. And Robert brought this up briefly, and I just was wondering if we could talk about this a bit. And so I'll start with either Wendy or Jessica, and then I'd also either Simon or Danny to respond. Can you just talk briefly about EPUB 3 with audio versus the new audiobook standard, and talk about, you know, the similarities, differences, where those two things intersect?
I'll go first, I guess.
Yeah, thanks.
I've thought about this a lot because this is like the #1 question that I get asked when we first started talking about the audiobook spec was, well, why not EPUB? You guys are all working on EPUB. There's actually going to be an EPUB 3 working group again soon. We're going to work on an EPUB again. So this is all the more prescient. But one of the main reasons why we didn't opt to just modify EPUB or just advertise that EPUB could technically do this already, which it can, is that this wasn't how audio publishers were working. I think if audiobook publishers had either been already producing with EPUB and maybe they just needed a little bit, they wanted a few changes to EPUB to make this more doable, or if they were expressing interest in using EPUB and just weren't because of some technical problem, then we would have gone that direction. But the reality is that nobody was using EPUB for this purpose, and it didn't seem like a good idea to then try and push them into that, because I love EPUB as a publishing format. I think it is incredibly powerful for the distribution and accessibility of ebooks. But when it comes to non-text media types, even fixed layout presents challenges with images. I think when it comes to multimedia like audio and video, EPUB is maybe just a little too heavy. It's got a little too much packaging, a little too much extra stuff that wouldn't make for I think the audio experiences that people are expecting to have. So that's like, great. Yeah.
That's a good overview. Thanks, Wendy. Jessica, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Wendy hit the nail on the head, and just from a publisher perspective, the idea of getting publishers to create an EPUB that has like even just a slightly richer EPUB than what we create now is difficult. So there's not the technical knowledge, especially in smaller houses, to create those, as Wendy said, heavy ebooks, and that's a really great way to describe it. Yeah, I think that creates a technical barrier that just having a very simple audiobook sort of shell that takes what you're already creating for an audiobook and just adding a little bit more information, that's a lot easier to delve into than to really start messing around with audio video stuff in an EPUB file. And also, as Wendy mentioned, there are people in publishing who do audio and do print books and they do ebooks, but there is the whole part of the audiobook industry that are only audio publishers and have no sort of connection to the EPUB side, the ebook side that publishers and digital vendors have been working on for years. That whole audio publisher side, they work only in audio formats and they do what they know. So it doesn't make a ton of sense for them to adopt a format that is 90% geared towards not what they're doing.
Great, that makes sense. We are actually running near the end of our time. So if either Danny or Simon, if you want to make like just a really quick, maybe sentence or two, comment on that question with regards to the user experience on sort of the new audiobook standard versus the EPUB 3 standard for introducing audio.
Well, I think the only thing I have to add is that audio in EPUB is wildly unsupported in a lot of reading apps. So I think people would have a lot of difficulty downloading an audio EPUB and playing it in their reader of choice because so many of them just don't support it properly. And it definitely is, EPUB is definitely a text-first format right now. So I think it's fair to say that it doesn't make sense.
Good, thanks, Simon.
I like your term, Jessica, of an audiobook shell, and that's exactly what's so exciting about this, is when you purchase an audiobook, you want it to look and feel like an audiobook, and that's exactly what this standard brings to the table. It doesn't feel like a paperback with a CD just tucked into the front cover at the last minute. This really feels like a top quality product that was built to house exactly what it contains. It's really great for that reason too.
Great, thanks, Danny. We're just going to have everybody sort of do their last final sentence or two. And I think Danny has just answered this question with his last statement, which is, what is the impact of improving the accessibility of audiobooks? And you've really articulated that well. So let's move through just the other folks briefly as our kind of final comments. Wendy.
I'm going to say that I just want to see the barriers get lowered for everyone. And I think this just add to plug my talk with Marisa. We did a demo of what one of these audiobooks looks like with text and with synchronized media. So if you look at the other, it's the most enjoyable audiobook in the world. I highly recommend trying it out if you haven't had a chance already.
Great, thanks, Wendy. Robert?
You know, we're all on the same page. Main thing I guess I would say is we should encourage more people in the marketplace to think the way we've been thinking for years. And it might sound posturing. It's not. Ideally, because we're based on donation dollars, ideally, the work that we're doing would actually be done by the people that are producing the books. And then the money that is being raised for CNIB could actually be used on other things like, you know, living skills or putting digital devices in people's hands and things like that. So I'm quasi-evangelical about talking about the mainstream value of accessibility. And it's not a hard sell. If you can get your head into the other person's position, you could do it. So I'm glad to see this conversation. I appreciate you having me here.
Great, thanks, Robert. Jessica, any final words?
I think for publishers, the interesting thing here is that adopting the specification or even creating audiobooks that are more accessible friendly just gives a longer lifespan to your content, which is something we're always desperate to do. You're creating something that is more future-proofed and can be adapted into future formats and technologies. And from an in-house perspective, adopting these workflows is going to help you create a born accessible workflow where your editors and your production people, the people at the beginning of the process who don't really think about accessibility, are now going to start thinking about it. They're going to be involved in writing image descriptions and thinking about how their content is going to translate into different accessible formats. And that's just going to create a better business for trade publishers.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. And finally, Simon, do you have some last thoughts on the impact of improving the accessibility of audiobooks?
I think that it will make audiobooks a lot more discoverable, and I can think of many situations where I personally have gone for an ebook because I know that I can't review the text if I get an audiobook. So if this does become, you know, the mainstream standard and people think to put text as part of their audiobook, I think that has huge potential. I'm really excited about that.
Great, thanks, Simon. Okay, well, I think we'll end our panel now. So thanks to Jessica, Danny, Robert, Simon, and Wendy. It's great to have you talk about these issues, and I really appreciate your time with us today.